When Arthur's daughter screamed "murderer" in my face, the police were already preparing to handcuff me. I was being accused of killing the patient I had cared for 10 years, just to steal his inheritance. But there was one thing those greedy vultures didn't know. The night before he died, Arthur had secretly summoned his lawyer. When that red-sealed envelope is opened and the final line is read, that arrogant family who called me the help will fall to their knees and beg. Justice isn't always found in a courtroom. Sometimes it's hidden in the final words of the dead. You won't believe what happens. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tag that disloyal friend in the comments. I'm Harper. For 10 years, my life was Arthur Beaumont's mansion in the humid, heavy air of New Orleans. Arthur was a legendary jazz musician, but for the last decade, he was just my patient. I was the only one by his side, changing him, feeding him, listening to his old records. His family? They were just ghosts that only appeared on Christmas cards. But the morning Arthur took his last breath, the mansion gates suddenly opened into hell. His daughter Marilyn, 52 years old, with a fortune in rings on her fingers, but not an ounce of mercy in her heart, stormed in. Behind her were his son Gregory and that spoiled grandson Chase. There were no tears in their eyes, I swear it. In their pupils, they only saw their father's bank account. Instead of looking at her father's lifeless body, Marilyn marched straight at me. She poked her finger into my chest and screamed, "You killed him! You switched his meds, didn't you? You waited for a weak moment. My father was perfectly healthy." Gregory jumped in immediately. "You've been sucking my father's blood for 10 years, brainwashing him for his money." Chase, phone in hand, was coldly calling the police, saying, "Yes, officer, my grandfather's caregiver has committed a suspicious death. Come immediately." In that moment, I felt my world collapse. My 10 years of labor, love, and sleepless nights, it had all instantly turned into a murder suspicion. They wanted to drag me out of that house, maybe even throw me in jail. Arthur's trembling voice echoed in my ears. The last thing he told me, "They will take their anger out on you, Harper. You stay strong." But even I couldn't have predicted this. Just as the police were about to grab my arm to take my statement, a shadow appeared in the doorway. Samuel Wright, Arthur's family lawyer for 40 years. He held a black leather briefcase and wore an expression cold as ice. "Nobody is going anywhere," Samuel said, his voice echoing through the grand hall. "No one leaves this house until Arthur's will is read." Marilyn laughed dismissively. "Read what, Samuel? Everything goes to us as the legal heirs. Throw this woman out of my house." Samuel didn't even look at Marilyn's face as he pulled a thick, sealed envelope from his bag. Deathly silence fell over the room. The lawyer tore the envelope, put on his glasses, and began to read that sentence. Watching Marilyn's arrogant smile freeze and turn into a look of pure horror was a sight I will never forget for the rest of my life. Samuel's voice cut through the room like a blade through silk, steady and deliberate, each word landing with the weight of Arthur's final judgment on his ungrateful family. "I, Arthur Beaumont, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, prepared 5 years ago in the presence of 2 witnesses and notarized by the state of Louisiana," he began. And I watched as Marilyn's fingers twitched nervously against her designer handbag, the same bag that probably cost more than I made in 3 months caring for her father day and night. Gregory shifted his weight from foot to foot like a schoolboy caught cheating on an exam, and Chase, that entitled 24-year-old who couldn't be bothered to visit his dying grandfather even once in the past 2 years, suddenly looked like he wanted to disappear into the expensive Persian rug beneath his feet. Samuel continued reading, his voice growing stronger with each sentence. "To my daughter Marilyn, who visited me exactly 4 times in the last decade, always with her hand extended asking for money to fund her ridiculous business ventures that failed one after another, I leave the sum of $50,000, not a penny more, because that is precisely what our relationship was worth to you, a transaction, never love." Marilyn's face went from pale to crimson in seconds, her mouth opening to protest, but no sound coming out, as if Arthur's words from beyond the grave had stolen her very voice. To my son Gregory, who couldn't find time to call his dying father but somehow always found time to send his assistant to inquire about my health, only when he needed to borrow money for his gambling debts that he thought I didn't know about, I leave the sum of $50,000 as well, and may you use it more wisely than you used every other cent I ever gave you." Gregory's jaw clenched so hard I could hear his teeth grinding from across the room, his face a mask of humiliation and barely contained rage. To my grandson Chase, who visited me 3 times in 10 years, each visit lasting less than 30 minutes because he was too busy checking his phone and posting on social media about what a burden elderly family members are to young people trying to live their lives, I leave the sum of $25,000 and my collection of vintage jazz records, which I know he will immediately sell without ever listening to a single note, because that is the kind of person he has become. Chase's face flushed with embarrassment and anger, his fingers still gripping his phone like it was a lifeline to escape this nightmare. Samuel paused, took a deep breath, and I felt my heart hammering in my chest because I knew what was coming next. I could see it in the way his eyes softened when they briefly met mine. To Harper Collins, the only person who stayed by my side through every painful day and sleepless night of the last 10 years, who held my hand when I was afraid, who listened to my stories when everyone else thought I was just a rambling old man, who treated me not as a burden or a bank account, but as a human being worthy of dignity and love, I leave the remainder of my estate. The room erupted into chaos immediately, Marilyn shrieking, "This is fraud!" Gregory lunging toward Samuel, demanding to see the document, Chase yelling about contesting the will. But Samuel raised his hand and his voice boomed with an authority that silenced them all. The remainder of the estate includes this house valued at $2.8 million, all bank accounts totaling $1.7 million, all royalty rights to Arthur's music catalog, which generates approximately $300,000 annually, the vintage car collection valued at $400,000, and all other assets not specifically mentioned, totaling an estate worth approximately $6 million. I felt the room spin around me, my knees going weak as the magnitude of Arthur's gift crashed over me like a wave. Not because of the money itself, but because of what it represented. His final statement to the world that I had been his true family when his blood relatives had abandoned him. Marilyn's scream pierced the air like a wounded animal. She manipulated him. She poisoned his mind against us. This will was made under duress. Samuel's expression remained unchanged as he pulled another document from his briefcase, this one thicker than the first. Arthur anticipated these exact accusations, which is why he also prepared this, Samuel said, holding up what appeared to be a journal bound in leather. This is Arthur's personal diary, kept meticulously for the past 8 years, documenting every visit, every phone call, every interaction with his family, and every day spent with Harper, all witnessed and notarized quarterly by myself and another independent attorney. He opened the journal to a random page and began reading in Arthur's own words. March 15th, another birthday has passed and not a single card from Marilyn, but Harper surprised me with a small cake and sang happy birthday in that terrible voice of hers that made me laugh until I cried. She is more daughter to me than the one who came from my own blood. Marilyn's face crumbled, tears streaming down her cheeks now. But they weren't tears of grief for her father. They were tears of rage and humiliation at being exposed so publicly for her neglect. Samuel turned another page. July 22nd. Gregory called today asking for a loan of $60,000. He didn't even ask how I was feeling after my fall last week that Harper stayed up all night monitoring to make sure I didn't have a concussion. When I asked Gregory how his children were, he couldn't even remember their ages. Gregory looked like he wanted to punch through the wall, his whole body trembling with fury and shame. Another page. December 3rd, Chase posted on his Instagram about how exhausting it is to deal with old people during the holidays. Meanwhile, Harper is here helping me write Christmas cards to old friends and colleagues because my hands shake too much to hold a pen steady. She has never once complained about the extra work, never once made me feel like a burden. Chase's phone slipped from his fingers and clattered on the hardwood floor, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw something resembling shame in his eyes. Samuel closed the journal and looked at each family member in turn, his gaze cutting through their defenses like a hot knife through butter. Arthur also included a clause in his will specifically addressing potential challenges. Any heir who contests this will automatically forfeit their entire inheritance, which will then be donated to the New Orleans Jazz Heritage Foundation in Arthur's name. Furthermore, any attempts to slander, harass, or legally pursue HarperCollins will result in the same forfeiture, plus a lawsuit for defamation that I am prepared to file on behalf of the estate. The fight seemed to drain out of them all at once, like puppets with their strings cut. They stood there in that grand room surrounded by Arthur's memories, his music, his life, and they finally understood what they had lost, not the money, but the man himself, and it was too late to ever get him back. The silence that followed Samuel's declaration was so thick you could have cut it with a knife, and I stood there watching Arthur's family process the reality that their greed had just cost them everything they thought they were entitled to, their faces cycling through shock, rage, disbelief, and finally a desperate calculation as they realized they were trapped between accepting their small inheritances or losing even that. Marilyn was the first to break, her voice coming out as a strangled whisper. "Harper, please, you have to understand we were just shocked by Father's death. We didn't mean those things we said. We were grieving." And the audacity of her sudden pivot from screaming murderer at me to begging for my sympathy would have been laughable if it wasn't so pathetically transparent. Gregory joined in immediately, his aggressive posture melting into something that resembled pleading. "We know you took good care of him. We were just emotional. You know how it is when you lose a parent. You're not thinking straight." Conveniently forgetting that he'd been accusing me of switching medications and essentially murdering their father just minutes ago. Chase picked up his phone from the floor, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. "Look, I'm sorry for calling the cops. I'll tell them it was a mistake, that we were just upset and overreacted, no harm done, right?" But Samuel wasn't having any of it. He gathered his papers with methodical precision and addressed the room with the finality of a judge delivering a verdict. The will is ironclad, witnessed, notarized, and Arthur was evaluated by 2 independent physicians who confirmed his mental competency at the time of its creation. You have 72 hours to vacate any personal belongings you may have stored in this house, after which time it becomes Harper's property in its entirety, and you will be considered trespassers. Marilyn's legs seemed to give out, and she sank into one of Arthur's favorite armchairs, the same chair where he used to sit and tell me stories about performing at the jazz clubs in the French Quarter back in the 1960s when the music flowed like the Mississippi River, and the nights never seemed to end. "This can't be happening," she muttered to herself, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the chair's upholstery. "We're his children, his blood. How could he do this to us?" And that's when something inside me finally snapped. All the years of watching them ignore Arthur's calls, all the holidays they skipped, all the times he asked me if they might visit this weekend, and I had to watch hope die in his eyes when they canceled again, all of it came flooding out. "How could he do this to you?" I heard myself say. my voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside me. "Arthur didn't do anything to you. You did this to yourselves. Every missed birthday, every unanswered phone call, every time you treated him like an ATM machine instead of a human being, you made these choices." Gregory stood up, some of his earlier anger returning. "You don't know what it was like growing up with him. He was never there for us, always on tour, always choosing music over his family. Why should we have dropped everything for him in his old age?" And suddenly I understood something that Arthur had tried to tell me once, but I hadn't fully grasped until this moment, that their neglect wasn't just cruelty, it was revenge. A decades-old wound that they'd nursed and fed until it consumed any love they might have had left. "You're right. I don't know what that was like," I said quietly. "But I do know what the last 10 years were like, and I know that Arthur spent those years trying to make amends, trying to reach out, trying to be the father and grandfather he hadn't been before, and you threw it back in his face every single time." Samuel cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional turn the conversation had taken. "I think it's best if everyone takes some time to process this, Harper. I'll need you to come by my office tomorrow to sign some papers and discuss the transition of assets. As for the rest of you, I suggest you consult your own attorneys if you have concerns. But I can tell you right now that contesting this will is futile and expensive." As they filed out of the house, Marilyn paused at the door and looked back at me with something that might have been genuine pain beneath all that bitterness. "Did he really hate us that much?" she asked. And for the first time since they'd arrived, I saw a glimpse of the little girl who'd probably once loved her father before time. And disappointment had turned that love to resentment. "He didn't hate you," I told her honestly. "He was heartbroken by you. There's a difference. He kept every card you ever sent him, every school picture, every newspaper clipping about your business ventures. He loved you until his last breath. He just couldn't figure out how to make you love him back." She stood there for a long moment, tears streaming down her face now, real tears this time. But then Gregory called her name impatiently from the driveway, and the moment shattered like glass. She wiped her eyes, straightened her shoulders, and walked out of her father's house for what might be the last time. When the door finally closed behind them and Samuel had left with promises to call me in the morning, I found myself alone in Arthur's mansion, truly alone for the first time since his death, and the weight of everything that had happened crashed over me like a tidal wave. I walked through the empty rooms, each one filled with memories of Arthur. The music room where he'd taught me to appreciate jazz even though I'd grown up on country music. The library where we'd spent countless afternoons reading to each other when his eyes got too weak to see the words clearly. The kitchen where I'd learned to make his favorite gumbo exactly the way his mother had made it 70 years ago. I ended up in his bedroom, the room where I'd found him that morning, peaceful and still, looking like he was just sleeping except for the absence of that slight snore he always tried to pretend he didn't make. And I sank down onto the edge of his bed and finally let myself cry. Not tears of grief, because I'd already done my grieving in the days leading up to his death when I'd known it was coming, but tears of gratitude and disbelief and overwhelming emotion at what he'd done for me. On his nightstand was an envelope with my name written in Arthur's shaky handwriting. Samuel must have left it there. And with trembling fingers, I opened it to find a letter dated just 2 weeks before his death. "My dearest Harper," it read. "If you're reading this, then I've finally shuffled off this mortal coil, as they say. And I hope I went peacefully with you by my side, because that's exactly where I want to be when the curtain falls. You've given me the greatest gift anyone can give another person. You've let me feel loved and valued in my final years, when most people are forgotten and warehoused away. You treated me like I still mattered, like my stories were worth hearing, like my existence had meaning. I know my family will cause trouble, they always do, but I've made sure they can't hurt you. Everything I'm leaving you isn't just money and property. It's my way of saying thank you for being the daughter I wish I'd deserved, the friend I needed, the light in my darkness. Don't feel guilty about accepting it. You earned every penny through your kindness and care. Use it to build the life you've always dreamed of but never pursued, because you were too busy taking care of an old Jasmine. Go back to school like you always wanted. Travel to Paris like you talked about. Find love if you haven't already. Live the kind of life that would make me proud to have known you. And Harper, one more thing. In the attic, there's a trunk with my name on it. Inside, you'll find something I've been saving for you. Call it my final gift, my last surprise. Thank you for everything, my dear girl. Thank you for making an old man's last years his happiest ones. With all my love, Arthur. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the letter, and I read it again and then a third time, trying to absorb the depth of emotion in every word. Arthur had never been particularly expressive with his feelings. He was a musician who let his instruments do the talking, but here, in black and white, was everything he'd never quite managed to say out loud. The attic. I'd been in Arthur's attic exactly once, months ago, when he'd sent me up there to find some old photographs for an interview with a jazz magazine, and I remembered it being crammed with boxes and trunks and the accumulated debris of a long and interesting life, but I didn't remember any trunk specifically marked with his name. I climbed the narrow stairs to the third floor, pulled down the attic ladder, and ascended into the dusty warmth of the space beneath the roof. And there in the corner, illuminated by the single bare bulb hanging from a rafter, was a large steamer trunk with AB monogrammed on its leather surface, the kind of trunk musicians used to take on tour back when travel was glamorous and train compartments had their own kind of romance. I dragged the trunk into the light and found it wasn't locked. The latch opened with a soft click that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet attic, and when I lifted the lid, I gasped because inside wasn't what I'd expected at all. There were no old costumes or instruments or memorabilia. Instead, the trunk was filled with carefully organized files, legal documents, and on top of everything was another envelope marked "Read this first" in Arthur's handwriting. Inside was a letter that would change everything I thought I knew about Arthur Beaumont and why he'd really left me his fortune. Harper, the letter began. What I'm about to tell you, I've never told another living soul. Not my children, not my closest friends, not even my previous wives. And I need you to understand the full truth before you accept what I'm leaving you, because you deserve to know that this inheritance isn't charity or even just gratitude. It's restitution for a debt that should have been paid 50 years ago. My heart started racing as I continued reading, trying to make sense of what Arthur could possibly mean by a debt from half a century ago when I wasn't even born yet. In 1968, I was 29 years old and playing trumpet in the hottest jazz club in New Orleans. I was married to my first wife, Catherine, your grandmother. And I had to stop reading and reread that sentence 3 times because it couldn't possibly say what I thought it said. But there it was in black and white, your grandmother. Catherine and I had a daughter together, a beautiful baby girl born in 1969 that we named Rose. But I was young and stupid and drunk on my own success. I was touring constantly, recording albums, living the life I'd always dreamed of. And I neglected Catherine terribly. I missed birthdays and anniversaries. I wasn't there when Rose took her first steps or said her first words. I was too busy chasing fame and drowning in whiskey and the adoration of crowds who didn't really know me at all. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the attic walls were closing in on me, because Rose was my mother's name. Rose Collins, who'd died when I was 15, who'd raised me alone after my father left, who'd never once mentioned knowing who her real father was. Catherine finally had enough and left me in 1971. She took Rose and disappeared, changed their names, moved away, and I was too proud and too angry to chase after them. I told myself they were better off without me, that I was doing them a favor by staying away, but the truth was I was just a coward who chose his career over his family. The letter continued, Arthur's handwriting growing shakier as if the emotion of writing these words had physically affected him. I tried to find them over the years, hired private investigators, followed leads that went nowhere. But Catherine had done a thorough job of vanishing. It wasn't until 15 years ago that I finally found a trail. I learned that Catherine had died in 1995, and that Rose, my daughter, had died in 2010, and that she'd left behind a daughter of her own, a girl named Harper, who was working as a nurse in New Orleans, less than 10 miles from where I lived. I couldn't see the words anymore through my tears. Couldn't process what I was reading. Arthur knew. He'd known all along that I was his granddaughter, that every day I'd spent caring for him, I'd been caring for my own grandfather without realizing it. I watched you for months before I ever approached you. I saw you leaving the hospital after your shifts, exhausted but still smiling, stopping to help a homeless man with his bandages, buying coffee for the security guard, being kind to everyone around you despite your own struggles. And I knew then that Rose had done a better job raising you alone than I ever could have done as a father. You were everything I'd hoped my grandchild would be, everything I didn't deserve. The letter explained how Arthur had carefully orchestrated our meeting, how he'd requested me specifically as his home care nurse through channels that made it seem random, how he'd spent the first year terrified I'd recognize something in his face or his stories and figure out the connection. But I never did. Why would I, when my mother had never mentioned having a father beyond saying he was gone before she could remember him? I told myself 1,000 times that I should tell you the truth, that you had a right to know. But I was selfish, Harper. I was afraid you'd hate me for abandoning your mother, afraid you'd leave and I'd lose you like I'd lost everyone else, so I kept quiet and let you believe I was just a patient, just a job, when really you were my second chance, my opportunity to be the family member I should have been all along. There was more. Pages and pages of Arthur's confession, his guilt, his love, his desperate need to make amends for sins committed before I was born, sins that had rippled down through generations and shaped my entire life without me ever knowing it. The inheritance isn't random generosity, Harper. It's your birthright. It's what should have been your mother's, and through her should have been yours. I've watched you sacrifice your own dreams year after year, taking care of others when no one was taking care of you, working doubles and sending money to friends in need when you barely had enough for yourself. Being the kind of person I wish I'd been. This house, this money, everything I have, it's not a gift. It's what I owe you, what I owed Rose, what I owed Catherine. And even if you decide you hate me after reading this, even if you want nothing to do with the Beaumont name or legacy, I need you to know that caring for me these past 10 years has been the greatest honor of my life. Getting to know my granddaughter, even in secret, has healed wounds I thought would never close. Thank you for giving a selfish old man more than he deserved. Thank you for being exactly who you are. With all my love, your grandfather, Arthur. I sat in that attic surrounded by dust and shadows and the weight of revelation, holding the letter that rewrote my entire history, that transformed every memory I had of Arthur into something deeper and more complex and infinitely more precious. And I understood finally why he'd looked at me sometimes with such intensity, such emotion, such profound sadness. He'd been looking at the granddaughter he'd lost before he ever had a chance to know her, at the echo of the daughter he'd failed, at the living proof that some mistakes can never be fully undone, no matter how much you try to make amends. The trunk contained everything: birth certificates, marriage licenses, private investigator reports with my mother's photo, showing a woman I'd never seen smile in real life, smiling in these old pictures, clearly happy before life had worn her down. There were letters Arthur had written to Catherine over the years, never sent, apologies and explanations and justifications that she'd never read. There were photos of me that he must have, collected somehow, pictures from my high school graduation that he couldn't have been at, newspaper clippings about a nursing award I'd received, even printouts of my social media posts from before I'd locked everything down, evidence of a grandfather watching from the shadows of his own shame. And there at the very bottom of the trunk was one more thing, a small box containing a ring, delicate and gold with a small diamond that probably wasn't worth much monetarily, but was priceless in meaning. And a note attached that said simply, "This was going to be Rose's 16th birthday present. I want you to have it now, 23 years late, but given with all the love I never got to show her." I slipped the ring onto my finger and it fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting all these years for me to claim it. And I sat there in my grandfather's attic in my grandfather's house that was now my house, holding my grandfather's letter and wearing my mother's ring, and I cried for the family I'd never known I had, for the grandfather who'd loved me in secret, for the mother who'd never known her father cared, for all the lost years and missed moments and the cruel irony that I'd finally found my family just in time to lose them all over again. The morning after I discovered the truth, I woke up in Arthur's bed, too exhausted to make it back to my own small apartment across town, and for a moment I forgot everything that had happened. I reached for my phone to check if Arthur needed anything before remembering with a sharp stab of pain that he was gone, that I was alone in this enormous house. Except I wasn't alone anymore, was I? I was surrounded by 3 generations of Beaumont history, by the ghost of a grandmother I'd never met, a mother who'd never known her own father, and a grandfather who'd loved me from behind a wall of guilt and secrecy. Samuel Wright called me at 9 a.m. sharp, his efficient voice cutting through my fog of grief and confusion. "Harper, I hope I'm not calling too early, but there's something else you need to know about the estate. Something Arthur instructed me not to reveal until after you'd read his letter in the attic." And I felt my stomach drop because what else could there possibly be? How many more revelations could one person handle in 24 hours? Arthur didn't just leave you his estate. He also made arrangements to ensure you'd never have to work another day in your life unless you chose to. The music royalties alone generate enough passive income to support you comfortably. But there's more. Arthur invested heavily in several tech startups back in the 1990s, when everyone thought he was crazy for putting jazz money into computers. Those investments have grown exponentially. There's a portfolio worth another $4 million that wasn't included in yesterday's reading, because Arthur wanted you to discover it naturally as you took over managing the estate. I was sitting at Arthur's kitchen table, the same table where we'd eaten breakfast together 1,000 times, where he'd taught me to appreciate chicory coffee and beignets, where he'd told me stories about playing with Louis Armstrong and Dizzy Gillespie. And now I was learning that this man, my grandfather, had been planning my financial security for years before his death. "There's also a letter of instruction," Samuel continued. "Arthur has outlined several charities he'd like you to consider supporting, but he's left all final decisions to you. He particularly wanted you to think about establishing a music scholarship for underprivileged children in New Orleans, something he wished he'd done years ago. And Harper, there's one more thing. Arthur left video recordings, hours of them, telling family stories, explaining family history, playing his favorite songs. He made them specifically for you over the past 2 years. They're on a hard drive in his music room safe. The combination is your mother's birth date." I hung up with Samuel and walked to the music room, a space I'd cleaned and organized hundreds of times but had never really explored. It was Arthur's sanctuary, walls lined with gold records and photographs of him with jazz legends, instruments in cases and on stands, a baby grand piano that he could no longer play but couldn't bear to get rid of. And in the corner, a safe I'd assumed contained important documents or maybe jewelry. The combination worked on the first try, 061711969, and inside was a hard drive labeled, "For Harper, my granddaughter, my final concerts." And I knew that when I plugged this drive in and pressed play, I'd hear Arthur's voice again. I'd see his face, and I'd have to confront the full reality of what I'd lost and what I'd gained simultaneously. But before I could bring myself to watch those videos, before I could face seeing Arthur's confession in his own words, I heard the doorbell ring, insistent and aggressive, And when I looked through the peephole, I saw Marilyn standing there, alone this time, her face blotchy and red, like she'd been crying all night. And against my better judgment, I opened the door. "I know you probably don't want to see me," she started before I could say anything. "I know I was horrible yesterday, worse than horrible. I accused you of murder. I tried to have you arrested. I said unforgivable things. But I need to talk to you. I need to understand." I let her in, not because I'd forgiven her, but because she was Arthur's daughter, my aunt, though she didn't know that yet, and maybe she deserved to hear the truth. Maybe we both needed this conversation to move forward. We sat in the living room, the same room where Samuel had read the will just yesterday, and Marilyn looked smaller somehow, diminished, like anger had been the only thing holding her together, and now that it was gone, she was collapsing in on herself. "I found some things last night," she said quietly, pulling out a stack of letters from her purse. "I went home and started going through old boxes, stuff I haven't looked at in decades, and I found these letters from my father, letters he sent when Gregory and I were kids, after he divorced our mother, letters we never saw because our mother hid them from us. She told us he didn't care, that he'd abandoned us completely, but he didn't. He wrote us every week for years, asking about school, sending money, begging for visitation, and we never knew." She was crying now, real sobs that shook her whole body, and I felt my anger softening despite myself because this was a woman discovering that her entire narrative about her father had been built on lies, that the abandonment she'd nursed into bitter resentment had been at least partially manufactured by a mother who'd been hurt and wanted her children to hurt him back. "Our mother filled us with poison," Marilyn continued. "She told us he chose music over family, that he was selfish and uncaring, that we were better off without him, and we believed her. Why wouldn't we? She was our mother. She was the one who stayed. So when he finally stopped trying to reach us, we thought it just proved she'd been right all along. But these letters, Harper, these letters show a man who loved us desperately and was shut out, rejected, punished for crimes we never gave him a chance to explain." I thought about the trunk in the attic, about the parallel collection of letters Arthur had kept, unsent apologies to my grandmother Catherine, proof that his pattern of loss and regret went back generations, that he'd been trying to make amends for longer than I'd been alive. "There's something you need to know," I found myself saying, and then I told her everything about the letter in the attic, about Arthur being my grandfather, about my mother Rose and grandmother Catherine, about the decades of separation and secrets, and I watched Marilyn's face cycle through disbelief, shock, recognition, and finally, a strange kind of relief, as if learning she had a blood connection to me made yesterday's reading less of a betrayal and more of a family reconciliation she hadn't known she needed. "You're my niece," she whispered, reaching out to touch my hand tentatively. "We're family, actual family, and I accused you of murder. I tried to destroy you when you're the only real family I have left." And I saw in her eyes the same desperate need for connection that I'd seen in Arthur, the Beaumont family curse of recognizing love only after it was too late to do anything about it. We sat there for hours, Marilyn and I, piecing together the fractured history of the Beaumont family, comparing stories and filling in gaps. She told me about growing up with a father who was physically absent, but whose presence loomed over everything, whose success made them proud, but whose absence made them angry, who they loved and resented in equal measure until resentment won. And I told her about growing up with a mother who worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat, who was loving but sad in a way I'd never understood until now, who'd given me her maiden name Collins instead of whatever name she'd been using when I was born, effectively erasing any trace of Beaumont lineage. "Gregory needs to know," Marilyn said finally, "and Chase, they deserve to understand what really happened, why Father did what he did. Maybe it won't change anything about the money. Maybe they'll still be angry, but they should know the truth." And I agreed, because secrets had poisoned this family for long enough, because Arthur's final gift to me shouldn't be built on the same foundations of shame and silence that had destroyed his other relationships. When Gregory and Chase arrived an hour later, clearly dragged there by Marilyn against their will, I saw the defensive hostility in their faces, the assumption that this was some kind of trap or manipulation. But Marilyn told them before they could launch into accusations. She just blurted it out. Harper is Father's granddaughter, his actual biological granddaughter. He didn't choose a stranger over us. He chose family he'd lost and found again. And the room went silent as she explained everything we'd discovered. Gregory's reaction was different than I'd expected. Instead of anger or disbelief, he just looked tired, defeated, like this was the final confirmation of something he'd always suspected. "He tried to tell me once," Gregory said quietly. "About 3 years ago, he pulled me aside at Christmas, one of the few times I actually showed up, and he started talking about second chances and lost children and making amends. But I was drunk and angry about something. I can't even remember what now. And I cut him off, told him I didn't want to hear his philosophical rambling, and he just nodded and changed the subject. He was trying to tell me about you, wasn't he? He was trying to explain before it was too late." Chase had been silent through all of this, staring at his phone but not actually looking at it, just using it as a shield against emotions he didn't know how to process. But finally he spoke, his voice cracking slightly. "I have this video on my phone. I recorded it like 2 years ago. I was visiting Grandpa because my mom bribed me to, offering to pay my rent if I'd just go see him once, and I was filming everything to post some snarky story about obligations to elderly relatives. But Grandpa didn't know I was recording, and he started talking about you, Harper, about how proud he was of you, how you reminded him of someone he'd lost, how taking care of him was the best thing that had happened to him in decades, and I was going to post it with some caption about him being senile or whatever, but something stopped me. I watched it later, and the way he looked when he talked about you, it wasn't the look of an old man talking about his nurse. It was the way my dad looks at old pictures of us when he thinks no one's watching. It was love, real love, and I didn't post it because even I'm not enough of a jerk to mock that." He pulled up the video and turned his phone around, and there was Arthur, looking stronger than he had in his final months, sitting in the garden where he loved to listen to the birds, and his voice filled the room. "Harper's working a double shift today, so I'm on my own, but she called 3 times to check on me. She worries even when she shouldn't. She's got her mother's heart, caring for everyone except herself. I wish Rose could see the woman her daughter became. I wish I could tell Harper that every day with her feels like a gift I don't deserve, like the universe giving me one more chance to be the grandfather I should have been all along. But I'm afraid if I tell her the truth, she'll leave. She'll realize I'm just another old man who failed his family, and I can't lose her. I can't lose my granddaughter again. I'd rather die with her, thinking I'm just a grateful patient than drive her away with the weight of my mistakes." We all watched that video in silence, and when it ended, Chase was crying, actual tears streaming down his face. "I've been such an asshole," he said. "I'm 24 years old, and I've been acting like a spoiled child. I had a grandfather who loved me, and I couldn't be bothered to love him back, and now he's gone, and the only person he trusted with his legacy is someone I tried to have arrested yesterday. What kind of person does that make me?" I looked at these 3 people, my aunt, my uncle, my cousin, strangers who were family who'd been strangers, all of us broken by the same old wounds, all of us trying to figure out how to move forward from here. And I thought about what Arthur would want. Not Arthur the wealthy man leaving an inheritance, but Arthur the grandfather who'd spent 10 years secretly loving his granddaughter, who'd left me everything not out of spite for his other family, but out of a desperate need to make things right with at least one person before he died. "I'm not going to pretend yesterday didn't happen," I said carefully. "You said terrible things. You accused me of horrible crimes. You treated me like I was dirt under your shoes. And those words did damage that can't be erased. But I also understand now where that anger came from. Generations of hurt and miscommunication, and parents poisoning children against parents. It's a cycle that's been repeating in this family since before any of us were born. And maybe Arthur left me everything partly hoping I'd be the one to finally break that cycle. Marilyn leaned forward, her eyes desperate and pleading. What are you saying, Harper? Are you saying you might share the inheritance? That you'd consider splitting things differently than the will specified? And I could see the hope blooming in all their faces, the same greed that had motivated their initial accusations transforming into a more acceptable kind of wanting, wrapped in the language of family and fairness. And second, chances. But I knew if I gave in to that pressure, if I tried to buy their love or forgiveness by redistributing Arthur's estate, I'd be dishonoring everything he'd tried to do. I'd be proving that money was all that mattered to any of us. No, I said firmly. I'm not going to change the inheritance. Arthur knew exactly what he was doing and why. He left you each something, more than most people have, enough to be comfortable if you're smart with it, and he left me the rest because it was rightfully mine through bloodline, and because I was there when you weren't. That's not changing. But what I am offering is this. A chance to be family, actual family, not people fighting over a dead man's money, but people who share blood and history, and now a common understanding of where we all went wrong. Gregory laughed bitterly. So you get millions and a mansion, and we get what? Sunday dinners and birthday cards. How generous of you, Harper, really making us feel like family there. And I felt my temper flare because I was trying. I was offering more than they deserved after yesterday, but they still couldn't see past the money. You know what? You're right, I said, standing up. This was a mistake. I thought maybe we could build something here. Maybe we could be the family Arthur wanted us to be. But you're still just looking at dollar signs, still calculating what you think you're owed. So here's what's going to happen instead. You have 72 hours to collect your personal items, like Samuel said. After that, I'm changing the locks and installing a security system. You want to contest the will? Go ahead. Waste your inheritance on lawyers and lose everything out of spite. Or you can take your $50,000 each, invest it wisely, and move on with your lives. Either way, I'm done trying to apologize for being loved by a man who desperately needed someone to love. I walked toward the door, ready to throw them all out, but Chase stood up suddenly. Wait, please, Harper, wait. You're right, we're being greedy jerks again. It's like we can't help ourselves. It's this family disease or something. But I don't care about the money. I mean, I do. I'm broke and $50,000 would change my life. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because yesterday I lost my grandfather, and today I found out I have a cousin. And maybe it's stupid, but I don't want to lose the cousin too. I don't want to leave this house and spend the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if we'd managed not to screw this up like we screw everything up. His words hung in the air, raw and honest, in a way I hadn't expected from someone who'd spent yesterday filming my humiliation on his phone. And I saw something in his face that reminded me of Arthur, that same desperate need for connection fighting against a lifetime of defensive self-preservation. And I realized that maybe the Beaumont family curse wasn't just recognizing love too late. It was being so afraid of vulnerability that we pushed away the very people we needed most. Okay, I said finally. Okay, Chase, you want to be family? Prove it. Arthur's videos, the ones he recorded for me, I haven't watched them yet because I can't face it alone. Watching him explain everything, hearing his voice, seeing his face, knowing he's gone, it's too much. So you want to be family? Come watch them with me. Sit with me while I learn about our grandfather, and maybe we can start to understand how to be Beaumonts who actually love each other instead of destroying each other. 2 years have passed since that day in Arthur's living room when everything changed, when a family built on resentment and misunderstanding took its first tentative steps towards something resembling actual love. And I'm sitting now in what used to be Arthur's music room, but has become something entirely different, something he would have loved even more than what it was before, The room is full of teenagers, 12 of them today. Kids from the lower Ninth Ward and Trem and Gentilly. Kids who grew up in neighborhoods where music is in the air you breathe, but opportunities are scarce as hen's teeth. And they're here for the Arthur Beaumont Memorial Music Scholarship Program, learning jazz from some of the best musicians in New Orleans, using instruments that Arthur collected over his lifetime, playing in a space that once held only memories but now holds futures, being built one note at a time. Marilyn is here too. She comes every Tuesday to teach the business side of music, how to manage royalties and negotiate contracts and protect your art from people who'd exploit it. She's good at it, actually. All those failed business ventures gave her expertise in what not to do, and watching her with these kids, seeing her pass on knowledge that might have saved her own relationship with her father if someone had taught them both how to communicate, it's like watching redemption happen in real time. Gregory runs the administrative side of the foundation, handling applications and fundraising and all the paperwork that makes a nonprofit function. He's sober now, 2 years clean, and he tells anyone who'll listen that Arthur's death was his rock bottom. The moment he realized he'd wasted decades being angry at a man who'd been trying to make amends while Gregory was too drunk to notice. He's not perfect. He still has hard days, but he shows up, consistently, reliably, and that's more than he ever did when Arthur was alive. Chase lives in the carriage house behind the main mansion. He's enrolled at Loyola University studying music therapy, finally finishing the degree he'd abandoned 3 times before. And in exchange for free rent, he maintains the property and helps run weekend jam sessions where scholarship students can practice with professional musicians. He's the one who had the idea to digitize all of Arthur's old recordings and create an online archive so future generations could hear the music that made New Orleans jazz history. And sometimes late at night I hear him in the carriage house playing piano. Not great, but getting better. Teaching himself the songs his grandfather used to play, connecting with Arthur in the only way he has left. The mansion itself has become something between a museum and a living space. The ground floor is open to the public 3 days a week, guided tours that tell Arthur's story, the music room where scholarship classes happen, a small performance space where we host monthly concerts featuring local jazz musicians who need exposure, and upstairs, the private floors. That's where I live, surrounded by Arthur's books and photographs and the accumulated treasure of a life fully lived, and I've never felt more at home anywhere. I went back to school like Arthur wanted, got my master's degree in nursing with a specialization in palliative care, because taking care of Arthur taught me that there's profound meaning in helping people navigate their final chapter with dignity and love. And now I split my time between working at a hospice center and running the foundation, using Arthur's money to make sure other families don't lose the years we lost, don't waste precious time on anger and resentment when they could be building memories instead. The ring Arthur left me, the one meant for my mother, I wear it every single day, and sometimes when the light hits it, just right. I think about the chain of losses and found connections that had to happen for me to end up here. My grandmother, Catherine, who fled with a baby and never looked back. My mother, Rose, who grew up never knowing her father's name. Me, Harper, who spent 10 years caring for my grandfather without realizing the man whose hands I held and whose stories I treasured was my own blood. And it breaks my heart and fills it simultaneously, the tragedy and the beauty of it all tangled together like jazz improvisation where you can't separate the sorrow from the joy. Samuel Wright still comes by monthly to review the foundation's finances and make sure I'm managing the estate properly. But he's become more friend than lawyer over the past 2 years. He brings his wife Diane, and they tell stories about Arthur from back in the day, when he was young and wild and full of fire, before life had worn him down with regret. And sometimes Samuel will say something like, "Arthur would be so proud of what you've done here, Harper. This is exactly what he hoped for when he left you everything. Not just money passing from one person to another, but legacy, real legacy, the kind that changes lives and heals wounds and makes the world a little bit better than it was before." We still watch Arthur's videos sometimes, all of us together, Marilyn and Gregory and Chase and me, sitting in the living room with wine and tissues, listening to our grandfather explain the Beaumont family history, the mistakes he made and the lessons he learned too late, the deep abiding love he felt for all of us even when we couldn't feel it back, and each video ends the same way, with Arthur looking directly into the camera and saying, "If you're watching this together, if you've managed to become the family I always wanted us to be, then everything I did wrong was worth it. Because you, all of you, you're my redemption. You're proof that love can survive generations of pain if just one person is brave enough to break the cycle." There was one video we found at the very end of the hard drive, dated just 3 days before Arthur died, and in it, he looked weak and tired, but somehow more at peace than I'd ever seen him, and he spoke directly to me. "Harper, my darling granddaughter, if you're seeing this, then I'm gone, and you know the truth about who you are, who we are, and I hope you're not angry with me for keeping secrets, for being a coward who loved you from the shadows instead of claiming you in the light, but I need you to know something that I never got to say out loud. You saved me, not from death, that was always coming, but from dying with regret as my only legacy. You gave me 10 years of being useful, of being loved, of mattering to someone in a real and tangible way. And even if you'd never known I was your grandfather, even if you'd gone your whole life thinking I was just another patient, those 10 years were the best of my entire life because of you, because of your kindness and patience, and the way you treated a broken old man like he still had value. So thank you, Harper Collins. Thank you for being exactly who you are. Thank you for letting me love you even when you didn't know I was loving you as family. Thank you for giving me peace. I hope this inheritance gives you freedom to build whatever life you dream of. And I hope you know that whatever you choose to do, wherever you go, I'll be proud of you. I'm already proud of you. The way grandparents are supposed to be proud of their grandchildren, unconditionally, eternally, with a love that doesn't end just because breathing does. Today marks exactly 2 years since Arthur died, since that terrible morning when I found him gone and his family accused me of murder, and my entire world exploded and reformed into something unrecognizable. And we're having a memorial concert tonight in the mansion's garden, scholarship students performing alongside professional musicians, playing Arthur's favorite songs and some new compositions inspired by his life and legacy, and tickets sold out within hours because Arthur Beaumont's story, the full story with all its pain and redemption and unexpected grace, has touched something in people's hearts, has reminded everyone that it's never too late to make amends, never too late to choose love over bitterness, never too late to become the person you wish you'd been all along. Marilyn and I are standing in the kitchen making food for after the concert, her famous red beans and rice that she's teaching me to make properly after 2 years of patient instruction, and she stops stirring and looks at me with tears in her eyes and says, "Do you think he knew when he was dying? Do you think he understood that everything would work out like this, that we'd all end up together, actually family? Or was he just hoping and praying and leaving it to chance?" And I think about that question, really think about it, remembering Arthur's face in those final days, the peace in his expression, even as his body was failing, the way he'd smiled at me and whispered, "It's all going to be okay, Harper, better than okay, you'll see." And I realize he did know. Somehow he knew that death wouldn't be an ending, but a beginning. That sometimes it takes losing everything to understand what actually matters. That his greatest gift to us wasn't money or property or even the truth about our family connection. It was the opportunity to choose differently than he had chosen, to be better than he'd been, to love openly instead of hiding behind walls of shame and regret. "Yeah," I tell Marilyn. "Yeah, I think he knew. I think that's why he could go peacefully, because he'd set everything in motion, planted all the seeds, and trusted us to do the rest, to grow into the family he'd dreamed of, but never managed to create when he was alive." That night, the garden fills with music, jazz floating up into the New Orleans sky like prayers or blessings or both, and I stand on the back porch watching scholarship students who never would have had this opportunity play instruments Arthur collected over a lifetime, and I see Gregory crying unashamedly as he watches his father's legacy literally come to life in the hands of children who needed exactly what we're giving them, and Chase is filming everything. But this time, not for social media mockery, but to preserve the moment, to document something beautiful and meaningful. And Marilyn is introducing herself to parents and grandparents who brought these kids here, telling them, "My father would have loved this. He would have been so proud." And she's right, Arthur would have been proud of the music and the foundation and the healed relationships, and most of all, of the fact that we chose to honor his memory not by fighting over his money, but by using it to create more beauty in a world that desperately needs it. Later, after the concert ends and the crowd disperses and it's just family again, the four of us sit in Arthur's favorite spot in the garden, the bench where he used to listen to birds and remember his glory days, and Chase pulls out his phone and plays that video he took 2 years ago, Arthur talking about me, without knowing he was being recorded, and we watch it together, and this time, instead of guilt or shame or regret, we just feel love. Simple, uncomplicated love for a complicated man who did his best with the limited tools he had, who failed spectacularly but kept trying anyway, who left us not just money but a roadmap for how to be better than he'd been. "I miss him," Gregory says quietly, and it's the first time I've heard him say it out loud without defensive posturing or bitter qualifications, just plain honest grief. "I miss my dad. I wish I'd had more time. I wish I'd known Harper was family earlier. I wish we'd had years instead of just those last few months of trying to figure it out." "But we do have years," Marilyn says, taking my hand on one side and Chase's on the other. "We have all the years ahead of us. We have time to be the family Dad wanted. We have time to make the most of this second chance he gave us. That's his real gift, not the money, but the time, the opportunity to get it right this time." And she's right. Arthur's greatest gift wasn't the inheritance that changed my life financially, wasn't the house or the royalties or the investment portfolio that keeps growing. His greatest gift was transformation, the way his death forced us all to confront our own failures and choose something different, the way his secrets once revealed became bridges instead of walls, the way his love, even given imperfectly and too late, created space for us to love each other better than we'd been loved. I think about the Harper who walked into Arthur's mansion 10 years ago, a nurse looking for steady work and good pay, who had no idea she was walking into her own family history, who spent a decade giving love to a patient who was secretly her grandfather. And I think about the Harper I am now, a woman who inherited not just wealth, but responsibility, not just property, but purpose. A woman who knows her own story finally, all the missing pieces filled in, all the mysteries solved. And I realize that even if I'd known from the beginning that Arthur was my grandfather, even if there'd been no secrets at all, I wouldn't have done anything differently. I would have stayed. I would have cared for him. I would have loved him, because that's who I am. That's who my mother raised me to be, and that's the greatest inheritance of all. Not the Beaumont money, but the Collins heart. The ability to love people even when they're difficult, even when they're imperfect, even when they're dying. As we sit there in the garden under the New Orleans stars with jazz still echoing in our memories and Arthur's presence still palpable in every corner of this house he loved, I feel something shift inside me, the last piece of grief transforming into gratitude, and I understand finally what Arthur meant in that last video when he said I'd saved him. Because he saved me too, saved me from a life of never knowing where I came from, saved me from financial struggle and limited options, saved me from the loneliness of believing I had no family left in the world, and most importantly, saved me by showing me that redemption is always possible if you're willing to do the hard work of making amends even when it costs you everything. The mansion lights glow warm behind us as the four of us sit in Arthur's garden. A grandmother's abandoned daughter, two children who felt abandoned by their father, a great-grandson who thought his grandfather was a burden, and me, the granddaughter who found her family by losing them first, and we're not perfect. We still argue sometimes. We still have hard days when old resentments resurface or new conflicts arise. But we show up for each other. We try. We choose family over and over again, even when it's difficult. And that's Arthur's real legacy. Not the music that made him famous or the money that made us comfortable, but the love that finally, against all odds, made us whole. Tomorrow I'll wake up in my grandfather's house, my house, and I'll go to work helping other families navigate end-of-life care with grace and dignity. And then I'll come home and work on foundation business, reviewing scholarship applications and planning concerts and managing the legacy Arthur left in my hands. And somewhere in between, I'll call Marilyn to check on her and text Chase to remind him about dinner on Sunday and email Gregory about the new fundraising campaign we're planning. And it will feel normal, like this was always my life. Like I was always part of this family, like Arthur was always my grandfather instead of my patient. But I'll always remember those 10 years of not knowing, of loving him without understanding why it felt so deep, why losing him hurt so much more than losing a patient should hurt. And I'll be grateful for those years too, because they taught me that family isn't just about blood, it's about showing up. It's about staying when things get hard. It's about loving someone, not because you have to, but because you choose to, day after day after day. And sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet and the ghost of jazz hangs in the air like perfume, I'll sit in Arthur's music room surrounded by his instruments and his memories and his love, and I'll whisper, "Thank you, Grandpa, thank you for everything. For the inheritance and the truth and the family, and most of all, for trusting me with your legacy, with your story, with your final act of love." And I swear sometimes I can feel him there, not haunting but blessing, not lingering in regret, but resting in peace, finally free from the guilt that chased him through life because he knows now that everything worked out, that we're okay. That his granddaughter, who he loved in secret, is thriving in the light, surrounded by family who finally learned how to love each other the way he always wished they would. And that's worth more than all the money in the world. That's worth everything. That's the inheritance that really matters, the one that transforms tragedy into triumph and turns an ending into a beginning that will echo through generations of Beaumonts yet to come, teaching them that it's never too late to make things right, never too late to choose love, never too late to become family.